How do you actually know that your podcast is working? This is a conversation that so many people have. Is it downloads? Are we looking at views on YouTube? What data actually matters? On today's episode of Profitcast, we are going to talk about data and podcasting. We're going to talk about what is working in data and analytics and what analytics you should actually be looking at. This is Profitcast. I'm Seth Silvers.
And I'm the real Brian. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. And Seth, I'm excited, man. Let's get into this and lead us.
Yeah. So I think this is really important, and this conversation has shifted so much in the last couple of years. Historically, people looked at downloads, mostly on Apple Podcasts and now kind of on Spotify. But you and I have both been in the industry a while. You've been in the industry just casually 3 times as long as I have. It's okay. Brian is 18 years old.
Yeah.
So I think like the conversations around analytics continue to change. I think in the last few years, there's kind of been this hating against the download, where people have been like, oh, downloads don't matter. And so we'll talk today some about how downloads actually, they do matter in many ways, but also they're kind of incomplete. And so I think the question of this episode really is, what analytics should we be looking at? I'd love to hear some of your experience, Brian, because you have been podcasting for quite a while. Profitcast in and of itself is 11 years old or something like that?
It started, we're going on 13 years this year already.
Yeah. Okay. So 13. So like when you started the show, was analytics something you were paying attention to? How were you paying attention to it? Like, what did that look like for you?
It was nowhere near as in-depth as it is today. Audio podcasts was completely separate from YouTube. It had nothing to do with YouTube at all. But back in the day, the audio podcast scenario was whatever Apple would give you. So it was iTunes back then, Spotify. I think Spotify was here, but it was barely here, because I remember beta testing Spotify for the United States, and I think it was 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there. And then it kind of came out, and that was not offering podcasts. So you were really limited to Apple Podcasts and then any of the apps that would allow podcasts on there. There were other programs, but mainly your analytics came from Apple, which was extremely limited. You got downloads, which might have meant a listen. It might have meant a download, like literally into your app. It might have meant somebody that listened for 1 second or for the entire show. You had no idea. And then they eventually started adding in some demographics, some geographic region, maybe how they were listening to your show, if it was on a browser or on an actual app or something, and which app. But it was very limited, and that was pretty much what you got.
Yeah.
And so interestingly, a lot of people were gaming the system. They were getting these downloads, or they were pushing downloads. And with the iTunes New and Noteworthy back in the day, if you remember that, that was if you could get into that, then your downloads would increase, which would then increase your rankings, which would ideally get you more. And that was kind of the big push for a while. Then that became a popularity contest. There wasn't a lot of strategy around it. There just wasn't a lot. You didn't have enough information. And so that's kind of how it all started. And so you paid more attention to good content and consistency is really what it came down to.
Brought the industry up to the last few years and kind of where we're at today with analytics, which is still lacking, but I think that it's better than people think. So I think the assumption is that analytics that's really poor in podcasting. And I think that comes out of a understanding or an overemphasis on the download. So real quick, let's talk about why the download is incomplete. We're speaking to this mostly from the perspective of businesses jumping into podcasting, or businesses that are trying to understand how to podcast in a way that grows their business. And so as a business, you're going to be wanting to look at the ROI of what you're doing. So I think the analytics side of this is super important. If you're a professional podcast or a hobby podcast, you might be looking at downloads maybe in a sense of that's going to be how you're going to negotiate sponsorships. So they're going to want to know how many downloads are you doing each month, price their ads based off of that. But the reason a download is incomplete, and this really comes back to the big iOS update. When you subscribe to a show on Apple and on most platforms, there's some version of auto downloading that happens.
Yeah.
That app is going to say, okay, cool, you've subscribed to Profitcast. And then when we release an episode with Profitcast, those episodes might already be downloaded. Mm-hmm. So Apple used to do this, and it would kind of stay updated. And I can't remember the exact specifics, but I might not visit a show for the next 12 weeks. And it would download all 12 of those episodes. And so then those downloads are technically being sold to sponsors.
Yeah.
So Apple changed their settings where I can't remember the exact limit. I think it's like 3 or 4. Like if it'll auto download maybe 3 or 4. And if you don't engage with the show after that, then it'll stop downloading. So most podcasts saw a drop in their downloads on Apple Podcasts, which at the time was definitely the predominant platform for podcasting. Now it's more debated than it was a year and a half ago. But most shows saw a dip in about 20 to 50% of their downloads. So there were some legacy podcasters whose main audience was on Apple Podcasts. They lost half of their downloads overnight, which is a problem if you're selling sponsorships. Technically, the data is more accurate now, so download actually matters more. But I think that is something that's like worth kind of understanding, is like why the download is incomplete. If I am scrolling through my library in Spotify, everything that every show I've subscribed to, the episodes in my library section on the app aren't necessarily all downloads. But if I click the download button, maybe I'm wanting to get on a plane, and so I click download to a few, and then I forget to listen to those. Those are all trackable downloads, even though I didn't actually listen.
Yeah.
So I think the big idea here is that we do want to be shifting away from downloads to tracking an audience. Like how many actual humans are listening to your content or are consuming your content. And the downloads are still important. I think it's still one of the main metrics of if your show is being consumed and people are sharing your show and your show is getting exposure in podcast apps, the downloads are going to go up. So you definitely want to see downloads continue to go up. But we want to be talking more about the actual audience that's listening and how many people are in that audience, and is that audience growing? So we're kind of seeing a shift in this. Brian, have you heard conversations or seen articles or LinkedIn posts, or what do you feel like the grumblings that you've been hearing over the last year around like analytics and data have been interesting to you? And you and I have talked about this too. So it might even be from conversations that we've had. And then later in the episode, we'll just talk through what analytics are we tracking for shows on a monthly and weekly basis. But what have you been hearing over kind of the last year in this shift in how we talk about analytics?
You know, before I answer that really quickly too, I wanted to share a little bit of history in advertising. And I've shared this on the show before, but it's been a while. So I figured I'll do a quick little review in case you're new to Profitcast. But in the radio days, when I was in radio, you talk about advertising and sponsorships on radio stations. But what I think most people don't even know this these days, is that, with the radio station, you've got an analog transmitter and it broadcasts over the airwaves into your radio, right? Your car radio, if you even have anything in the home anymore. But there was no way to track who was actually listening to your radio station ever. Now, granted, they had those little things where if they come to you and, you get chosen to do the survey, you might carry this little thing around and then write down when you actually listen to the radio station and how long. But I mean, let's be honest. How many people have actually ever been asked to do that? It's not a very accurate scenario. It's not a very good representation. So what they'll say in radio is that our tower has a reach of, let's just say, 100,000 people. Now, in that 100,000 people, our specific demographic for this radio station might be 30,000 people. So they call it a 30,000 cum, meaning that your ad has a chance to reach 30,000 listeners. Or in most cases, it's going to be a lot higher. They're actually going to probably bloat a lot of those numbers. So it's going to be more like 100,000 usually. But they'll say that your ad has a chance to reach that. Well, first of all, not all 100,000 are going to listen to your station. Not all 100,000 are going to be listening at that specific time that the ad goes out. And once it's been aired, it's gone. The thing with podcasting that a lot of people forget is once it's been aired, it's there forever. It's on the internet forever. So anybody can go back and listen to an episode years later and hear your ad. And so I think there's a lot of things to consider, that advertisers paid a lot of money for radio and there's no way to really track it. Whereas with podcasting, even though it's not the greatest tracking, it's far better than, radio ever has been. And then now with Spotify and even with YouTube and stuff like that, there's a lot more depth as far as the analytics and actually understanding who's listening, how long, and what are the specs. So I just wanted to throw that one in as a bit of history. But as far as what have I been hearing recently, the most recent one I heard that I was very fascinated by was how Spotify had taken over the majority of listenership for Gen Z. So they were saying that, I don't remember what the actual number was, but it was the majority on Spotify. Then I think Apple Podcasts was second, and then it kind of went down from there. Well, that was fascinating. And in many ways, that's a good thing because Spotify has the ability to add audio and video directly to their platform. And you have better analytics through Spotify than you do Apple. And it also, I think, is more universal, right? Apple is for Apple devices and Spotify can be for either one. So I do appreciate that. But that was a fascinating thing. What have you been hearing, though?
I think it's some of what I've been hearing, and then it's some of what we've been doing. And I think this
Yeah.
is an area where sometimes you find yourself like accidentally known for things. And this has definitely been the case over the last year where we've been called a lot to talk to people about podcast analytics. And so I guess some of the ways that I've been looking at things, I've been realizing like this is one area of podcasting that it is really easy for me to nerd out on.
Nice. I'm glad.
So maybe we need to go to your other show, The Real Brian Show, where we can nerd out on podcast analytics.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
But a lot of what I've learned has just been by doing. And also in the last year, we've gotten to work on some bigger shows where we're dealing every month in hundreds of thousands or millions of downloads. And so you're able to see data from a little bit of a different perspective. And so now we've been able to test some things out, track some things at a high level, and then pull them back to shows that are not at that level and realize, oh, some of these things are still true. The thing that I want to iterate here is I don't think data is worth tracking unless it changes behavior. This is one thing that I've learned from one of our clients, Alex Ramosi, and I think he does this really well internally at acquisition.com, where there's a lot of data points, but for them, it's like, okay, why are we tracking this? If this data point changed, then would our behavior change? That's the important thing.
Yeah.
If this data point changed, would our behavior change? And if it's not going to change, then I don't think we should be tracking it. So for us, like we're really looking at data on kind of 3 levels with all of our shows. I actually just got off a meeting today with our team where we're kind of revamping the analytics for all of our clients because we've been kind of testing things out over the last couple months. And so we're rolling this out. But the shows that I'm tracking analytics on, and for our team, we usually have about 20 shows that we're working on. And usually about 5 of those, I personally am a lot more deeply involved in. And I'm kind of testing out new things or watching the analytics or different things to then be able to say, okay, should we roll these tests out to all of the shows? So for us, like we have show analytics that we're looking at. We have monthly analytics that we're looking at, like a kind of a month tab. And this is we do it in Google Sheets for now. And then we have episode data. So we're kind of tracking like 3 layers of data of like show level, monthly level, and then episode data. So on the show level, that's kind of like our dashboard where that's pulling in data on a monthly basis. It's pulling in downloads, it's pulling in views, and it's pulling in followers.
Nice.
I'm not going to say subscribers because that's something that's changed.
Yeah.
Now that you can have premium shows on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they both have switched to the nomenclature of followers. And so followers, we're tracking followers on Spotify, followers on Apple, and followers on YouTube. I know there's a lot of other podcast platforms like Overcast, Simplecast, all of these things.
Yeah.
But we've generally seen that 80%, 90% of a podcast traffic is going to come from those 3 sources, unless you're heavily international or heavily advertising into those platforms, which is a whole nother conversation, but can work really well. This is all ideal. What I'm about to say. Ideally, we are pulling all of this data. Not everything is ideal, and not every show is using all of these platforms. But ideally, on a daily basis, we're not pulling this data daily. We're pulling it weekly, but we're documenting day by day downloads for YouTube long form. So this will be on YouTube, and this is the long form version of this episode.
Yeah.
For YouTube Shorts. So if we decide to cut shorts from this, we want to look at YouTube Shorts. We want to look at Spotify downloads, and we want to look at Apple Podcast downloads. Those can show up a little bit differently, but oftentimes that's just pulling from whoever your RSS host is. So we're actually looking at that on a daily basis of how many downloads or views are you getting on a daily basis. And what that begins to show us is it begins to show us a lot of trends week to week. Especially if you're publishing multiple times a week, it begins to show you trends on what days are your best days. If you ever accidentally publish later in the day, that's really going to be seen by those daily things. And the main thing here is we want to be tracking where we're at this month over last month. So we're going to be comparing that. Like what's the date today? It's the 25th.
Mhm.
So ideally, we're looking at, okay, up to this point, up to the 25th, we are up 3% from where we were on the 25th of last month. And so I think that's like a helpful number from a followers perspective and a downloads or views perspective. We do look at the downloads separate as kind of like YouTube views, but we're still looking at all of those as, okay, are these things going up or down? And again, the goal of all of these things is to give us benchmarks. We want to track a lot of data so that we can then have the benchmarks of, is something overperforming or underperforming? Like you're kind of just looking for a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is this episode doing well or is this episode not doing well?
Yeah.
Or 60 seconds into this episode, are we doing well or are we not doing well? And then you ask why. So I think the goal of like building these spreadsheets out and having all of this data and having these dashboards and all of these things, it really is to set benchmarks so that we can just see, is this episode underperforming or overperforming? And then you ask the question, why? I just want to like highlight the guys at Bumper with Dan Meisner and Jonas Voost. They're great. And I feel like them and I, like we think very similar with how we think of these things. And I think the articles that they've been putting out on their Bumper blog about tracking, about the data that they're looking at and tracking are brilliant. So I think those guys are doing it really, really well. They have a really cool dashboard that they've like custom built, and we're kind of still in this stage where we're doing it all a little bit more manually. If you can help me do it not manually, let me know. But so that's kind of where we're looking on like a monthly basis. So how this looks for us is we have this monthly tab that just shows like daily stats from the different platforms. If you're publishing on Instagram, if you're publishing clips on TikTok, we want to pull those in too. So you can kind of just see, are there trends between all of your platforms on like a daily basis over? And we're usually pulling that daily data once a week.
I don't know if we could do this, but if we could figure out a way to take a show with permission and stuff like that and actually screen share, showcase at some point, maybe we should do an episode here soon where we could screen share the dashboard, screen share the stats, and actually go through the stats one by one and say, okay, here's the yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down kind of situation. And then here's the why behind it. And then even showcasing, here's what we tried. Did it work? Yes or no? Or here's what we're going to try. I think that would be helpful because, as somebody who does not nerd out on this stuff like you do, it's a little bit harder to grasp, but also, and it just continues to change and it's getting more and more complicated. And I think a lot of people are starting to get a little bit overwhelmed with it. But it's important to know, right? It's important to figure out. And so having the specific examples and understanding why these things matter and why these changes actually work and stuff, I think that would be very, very helpful. Just because I think a lot of people do take that approach of, well, let's just give it our best and we'll look at the stats and it's good enough. We'll just keep going. And, then they never really get the success they want. So I think it'd be kind of cool to get into that.
That's a good idea. Because what most podcasters do, and I say most being a part of this, like I've been guilty of this with clients. I've been guilty of this myself. You come up with the idea for the podcast, you start creating the podcast, you check your downloads, every couple of weeks, and you do the same thing for a couple of years.
Yeah. Yes.
Like you just keep doing it. So, we've heard the advice that the most important thing in podcasting is what, Brian? Consistency.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, which one?
I was like, come on. Don't let me. I was going to say, but I feel like it's not as common. I feel like that advice isn't as common now, but I feel like there was like a few year period where people were like, oh, if you're just consistent in podcasting, it'll work. But if you're doing the same thing and the same thing sucks, even if you do it for 2 years, it's not going to work. And so I think a lot of people, they're not looking at the data to actually show what is working and what is not. Then they're just doing the same thing for like a year or two. And then it's like, oh, my podcast isn't growing. I don't know what's going on. So that's why like actually seeing these trends is important. If it's not interesting to you, then hire somebody that this is interesting. This is why we have a business, is because it's like, we want to know what is working, what is not working about your podcast.
It's funny because I was going to say it's not, and for me personally, it's not that it isn't interesting. I just don't nerd out on it. But I think I was thinking of Marcus Lemonis, the Prophet and Camping World and all that. He said, I don't care if you like numbers or not. If you're as a business owner, you have to like numbers. You have to figure it out. You may not love it, but same kind of thing here. I don't like stats, but I have to like stats. And I think as a podcaster, you have to like them and understand them. but it is overwhelming. So I think that's where we
Right.
kind of say, okay, how do we break it down and understand it for those of us who
Right.
maybe not, we're not as inclined towards that. The other thing I was going to say, you know Glenn Hebert, Glenn the Geek? Do you know him?
Yeah.
Okay. Great guy, right? When he was doing the Horse Radio Network, by the way, shout out to him. He was doing the Horse Radio Network, full on and stuff. And this was years ago. He told me we have a 3-month shelf life for our podcasts. Each and every podcast that gets started, we analyze and evaluate at that 3-month mark. If it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, but it shows potential, we'll give it another 3 months, but it has to change. It has to do whatever it needs to in order to reach the results we want. And then we'll reevaluate at that 6-month mark. And if it doesn't, show's cut. But at the 3-month mark, if it's not performing, we've done everything right, the show is cut at 3 months. So when you talk about, giving a show 2 years, that's probably a really stupid idea. And so, and it's, now granted, if it's for fun or you're doing this if you're a business, so I worked with a company, they had no care about the results of the podcast because it was a way for them to basically help their partners and to build relationships with their partners. So it was already successful regardless of what the actual stats and analytics showed. So that was a very different scenario. And so in cases like that, that's fine. Keep it going, do what you got to do. But in a case where the analytics and the stats very much matter, give it 3 months. And if it's not doing what it's supposed to, try another 3 months maybe, or cut it,
Yeah, I think that I love that example of Glenn the Geek, which for those that don't know, he's built a very successful career.
Empire.
Building the empire, building podcasts about horses. I love it. He does such a good job with it. So one other thing I want to highlight that I think is very important that most people are not doing is tracking data on like how your episodes are performing in a specific period of time. So I prefer 7 days with this. The problem with this I think the problem with how most people are looking at their episodes and if they're performing well or not is we kind of just look like you might log into your hosting platform and you might just look at your episodes and the downloads next to them. Everybody displays it differently. And you might just look at like those episodes are going to grow in downloads over time. You might have an episode that stays fairly flat and then maybe it gets included in a blog or maybe it like gets a life of its own a month or two or a year after you publish it.
True.
So that's great. But then if you're looking at that episode compared to your other ones, that's really giving you no information on how it actually performed when you published it. And so this is why we actually go in and we make sure that for all episodes, we're actually kind of like locking the data 7 days in. So we will combine all of the downloads and also YouTube performance on a 7-day period so that we know how did this episode perform within 7 days. And then we have one sheet that shows all of the 7-day performance. So the benefit of that, and I'll give an example. I was talking with a client this weekend and they have a frequent guest on their platform. Like, how do episodes perform? Like they knew it was good, but they were like, but tell me more about how episodes perform. So we were really easily able to go to that episode spreadsheet, initially look at not just the overall downloads, because they have some episodes that have just like grown massively since, over the months. But we were able to look and say, okay, the 3 episodes that had this guest on averaged this amount of downloads after 7 days. And then we were able to just compare that with what's the average total for all of the shows, all of the episodes or the last 100 episodes or something. And so we were able to look and be like pretty quickly, episodes with that guest performed 39% better within 7 days. So I think that is really, really helpful because the data is just going to be a little bit more skewed. And the people that are listening within 7 days, that's probably going to be kind of your more like loyal audience. But I think you want to focus on kind of locking certain aspects of data after 7 days. In almost every platform, you don't have to go in 7 days after you publish. Like you can initially kind of like download the stats for like you can give like a custom time frame. So this isn't like you're having to like log in at midnight of the 8th day and say, okay, what were the downloads or, what were the listens or different things. So there's a bunch of different specifics that like we could look at and we track a lot more than we're saying. But I think the main thing with this episode is shifting away from just, okay, cool. How many downloads are you doing? And more so looking at the size of your audience. This is where like Spotify is telling you how many unique listeners listen to your show this week. Apple's telling you how many unique listeners listened to your show this week. YouTube is saying how many distinct viewers, how many unique people watched your show, watched your content. That's the most important number to be going up. And so, yes, we want to be looking at 7-day data. Yes, we want to be looking at monthly data. Like all of these things are important and they're going to give us indicators of like what is going well and what is not going well. But at the end of the day, like I think that we do need to be shifting away from just one number of downloads each month and really thinking, is what we're doing causing more people to see our show or not? And even if it's by 1% a month, like, okay, that's probably better than industry standard right now. Like most shows have been shrinking in the last year.
It's interesting. I've been watching because, you can see these analytics on YouTube. And I've had some, getting into this and seeing what you're doing and stuff. I don't have access to a lot of the podcast analytics, but it has been fascinating because I've been watching YouTube channels who have, 1 million plus subscribers. And, a year ago they were doing 1 million, let's say between 750,000 to 1 million views per video. And now they're getting on average of 150 to 350,000. What's going on? They're not doing anything worse. If anything, they're doing better. They're creating, I think, more interesting content. But what's going on? So, I mean, these, you're right. When you talk about shows are shrinking, well, why? And these are questions I have that I'd like to get into. Is that, does that reflect the show? Does it reflect the hosts? Or does that just reflect listening and or viewing habits in general? And it has nothing to do with any efforts that you can or can't do.
Yeah. Well, in like one example, like a lot of people don't realize that you can see like retention and completion data inside of both Spotify and Apple. So a lot of people have known, I would say beyond downloads, like the most like sexy number people have talked about for a while in podcasting is completion rate in Apple Podcasts. Yeah. So you can at least see like what percentage of people are, or what percentage of the episode on average is being completed by listeners. You should be tracking that. Like we track that for every single episode. And we have a formula that gives kind of like a benchmark of what that completion rate should be based off of the duration of the episode. So like it matters that people are completing a high percentage of your episode. Then on Spotify and Apple, you can also see that like minute by minute or even like every 5 seconds. So you can look and see what percentage of your audience was listening 30 seconds in. So why would we look at that? If you're experimenting with how you start episodes, then that's a really good data point. Spotify just released in the last like 3 to 6 months. They just finally let us know, hey, way more people than you think are seeing every episode. And a stream on Spotify doesn't count until 60 seconds, which means I would say on average, like numbers I'm seeing is like typically between 60 and 80% of people that start an episode are still listening 60 seconds in.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting thing of like that means that, 20 to 30% of the people, hopefully not that much, hopefully like 10, but if we're industry standard, 20 to 40% of the people that clicked play on this episode on Spotify never made it 60 seconds in. So in that sense, like a pretty darn good way to grow your show is to get better at hooking people at the beginning. And if you're experimenting with hooks and how to start your episode, again, this all comes back to what does the data tell us and what behavior will it change? If your completion rate 60 seconds in is really bad, it should change the behavior of how you introduce your episodes.
Yeah, that's why we cut the intro to Profitcast because, normally it was hey, episode whatever we're doing, and then it would come in and have the nice little music and intro and everything else, and then we'd get into it and we'd say, hey, how's it going, and blah, blah, blah. And we thought, we're already a minute into the show and we haven't even started talking really about anything. Now, granted, if it's an entertainment show, great, that's exactly fine. But when you're doing more of an educational show, you got to jump right in, which is why we're trying this. And so here's an actual real life example of something we're trying. Then another thing I was going to say too is, listening or watching till the end of the episode. And it's interesting to me because I find that whether I am a host or I am a listener, my attention, and it's not even an attention span issue as much as it is, you're done with the topic. You don't need to talk anymore about this. And it's not like I'm bored or I need to move on to the next thing. There's really, now you're rambling. And it's so funny because I'll hear people that say, oh yeah, we do 2-3 hour episodes. And I'm like, do your listeners love it? Oh yeah, they totally love it. I have this thing where it's fascinating as a host. I'll just start to go, the conversation, it's dying now. I need to end the episode right now.
Yeah.
And then I can go and edit that out. But a lot of times people just keep talking. They keep talking. Like, I got to hit an hour. I got to hit this so-called mark in my show. So those are things to keep in mind, you know, even when you're doing that, that if you as the host are starting to lose interest or starting to see your mind wander, your listeners probably are too.
Yeah.
That's an analytic you can do without even looking at the numbers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we're just, again, the point of the data is to give us feedback on how our audience is behaving and what's good about our episode and what's not. We might change the intros. We might realize that like our episodes do dramatically better when we open with Brian telling a dad joke. Like maybe that's what we realize. So it's like, but to do that, you have to test it. Yeah. Maybe we should experiment with it. But I can tell you, like, if we're looking at this and, you know, only 75% of people on Spotify that click play are actually making it 60 seconds in. Sorry, that sucks. Like that sucks for us. Like we have to fix something.
We do.
And that data is really important. And so for many years, I think this is kind of a good closing point to this. Jeremy Inns and I, we've talked a lot about how more people are seeing your show than you think. We're just not good at retaining them. So it's like the platforms are probably like more people are laying eyes on your album artwork than you think. And we kind of started to finally get some proof of that with Spotify's analytics releases this year, where they actually start showing you how many people were reached, like how many impressions did your show get? And a lot of people are like, oh man, there's several thousand people that are seeing my show every single month that are not becoming listeners. So then it's like, okay, album artwork, maybe that could pull them in, maybe better titles. Like all of a sudden you introduce your title simply being the episode number and the person's name who you interviewed, who nobody knows. All of a sudden, if you start realizing like, oh man, 50% of people aren't even staying 60 seconds in, or 50% of people aren't even clicking on the episode, it starts to get you to rethink those things and think, okay, people are seeing my stuff. How do we keep them? How do we keep them around? So again, all of this stuff around analytics, it's like, what behavior is this changing? I think my favorite question is why. Okay, cool. Like
actually,
this data point's off. This benchmark is like up. The completion rate on this episode was way higher. The completion rate was lower. Like this month, we're outperforming last month, like to date by double. Like all of those things happen. Ask why.
I love the question in general, but yes, absolutely. Ask why. And then, you know, and it can come down to, are you likable? I mean, really, it may be that simple. It's amazing how many people just go, you know, you have great information, but we just don't like you, or you're boring or whatever. I mean, there's so many factors in here, and that's going to be a harder one, I think, for analytics to know, because you might try everything and do it all right, but how is an analytic going to tell you whether or not you are a likable host?
Yeah.
So, you know, but this is fantastic stuff. It's fascinating. I love it. And I'm excited to dive more into this too. And I would love to, if you're up for this, do a second episode here in the near future where we can dive into analytics, screen share it, and actually talk about it. So for those of you watching, you're going to get the benefit of actually seeing what we're doing versus those of you listening. We'll do the best we can to explain it, but I think this will be good. And by the way, we are on YouTube. So go to the YouTube channel and search for it. It's just at Rock My Podcast. That's where it is. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You can watch or you can listen. We're on all of the major things, as you know. We were just talking about all that. And then rockmypodcast.com is our website that you can go to. And if you'd like to work with us, we have all that information on there too. There's a ton of stuff that we actually do. Seth, you've already mentioned some of the things that you do specifically to help clients, and we're collaborating and working together, which is very, very exciting too. So we're excited for the future of Profitcast, and we're finally into this routine now where we're moving forward. We had a lot of, this is the other thing too, is analytics and stuff too. It's a lot of planning. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of understanding what we're doing, which is why there's been some pauses in between the episodes too, is going, well, we need to try this differently and we need to do this differently. And there's little nuances. And so we're finally on a roll with this, which is very exciting. But we hope that what we're doing and experimenting with and learning from will also help you, so that we're the guinea pigs. You don't have to be. You can just learn from our benefits or our failures. Either way.
Yeah.
Love
That's
it.
the goal.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Brian. This has been great.
Thanks. Thanks, Seth. Appreciate it. And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you in the next episode.